Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, radio talk show host Joseph Ashby. A lot of you have seen him on Wichita Liberty TV before. I think a lot of you listen to him on KQ AM radio, 1480 AM, or various ways on the internet, TuneIn app on your smartphone, 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, Monday through Friday mornings on Wichita's Big Talker. And Joseph, I think when you started about 4 years ago, there was really no other talk radio in Wichita except for sports. Is that right?
Yeah, there's multiple sports talk shows. Living here before that, living in the area, I just thought, is there really not a room for a local version of a Rush Limbaugh, or just a local talk radio host that had a conservative message, and it really wasn't there. And I was very excited for the opportunity to be the guy.
Well, I think since you started, your show's grown from 2 hours to 3 hours a day, and now with the addition of Andy Hoosier, there's 2 hours starting at noon, Monday through Friday, of his show, and then Rick Everett at 5 o'clock for an hour in the evening. So we appreciate the work that you do there, Joseph.
Thank you.
Now, you gave a talk at the Wichita Pachyderm Club a couple weeks ago that was really well received, I think, by the audience. And one of the topics that you mentioned was the Kansas judges. And specifically, these would be the Kansas Supreme Court judges, our state's highest appellate court. These judges are appointed through a process that's dominated by lawyers. They send 3 nominees up to the governor. The governor has to choose one of them, otherwise the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court gets to choose, I think. And there's been some concern that these judges may not really represent what Kansans really want to happen. These judges have to stand for retention votes. There are 7 justices, and through kind of a quirk of the way the law works, 5 of them, way more than a majority, are standing for retention this fall. November 8th, I believe, is election day. There's quite a bit of controversy. We've got campaigns being formed on both sides to reject the judges or to retain them. And I should say it usually falls down to a 4-to-1 breakdown there, because there's 4 judges that conservatives had trouble with, 1 judge, Caleb Stegall, that they're okay with. So what are the issues here, Joseph? Why are people so concerned about who the judges are on the Kansas Supreme Court?
Well, different people have different views. Kansans for Life, for example, is very worried about the abortion legislation that's working its way through the courts. A couple of sessions ago, the legislature passed a ban on dismemberment abortion, which is a second trimester procedure which dismembers the baby in the womb during the abortion. A district court judge said, that this is not only is this illegal, but the Kansas Constitution has such a right to an abortion that really any abortion restrictions are probably illegal. And the appellate court decided, couldn't decide. They were split 7-7 on that. And so there's a strong concern that this Supreme Court will side either in a limited way with that district court judge. That ruling currently stands and is on appeal, or they will decide all the way with him. And that could be a driving force. The court gets into a little bit of trouble because it gets into spending money, because it tells the legislature how much money they need to spend on education.
School finance
Yeah,
lawsuits.
how to divvy it up. And the real die-hard constitutionalists maybe are saying, I got to stand up for the separation of powers. The reality is, though, it would not be close if it were not for the death penalty cases that the Kansas court has overturned. In particular, the Carr case, which seemed the most egregious because there's a living witness, because it's not as if the Carrs were careful criminals. The evidence
really
was so overwhelming.
Case,
yeah, a horrific case, horrific crimes, and the evidence was so overwhelming that it got to the point where you think, how could a judge find any problem with the case, given the fact that the obvious biasing of the jury was because of the evidence, not because of anything else?
Yeah, so they were sentenced to death by a jury and a judge, and then, as happens, the appeals work their way. Should mention those crimes happened almost 16 years ago.
16 years,
yeah. But anyway, so the Kansas Supreme Court says there was some sort of technical defect with the way the judge and the jury came up with the sentence. Then the United States Supreme Court got involved. And what did the U.S. Supreme Court do?
Well, they overturned the Kansas court. Right after the Carr Brothers decision, which came in the summer of 2014, there was an outcry, particularly in the Wichita area where the crimes happened, saying, how could you possibly come to the conclusion that these people should be let out of this sentence? And the reason they gave was, well, the jury was biased because they sentenced them together, and they were given faulty instructions. And you saw a lot of lawyers, particularly on the left side of the aisle, but not exclusively, saying, well, you know, that's true. You shouldn't have sentenced them together, and that does bias the jury because one of the brothers ostensibly behaved poorly in the classroom compared to the other. And the Supreme Court got a hold of what the Kansas court had said. It was like, no, like the biasing happened. I mean, Scalia wrote, in essence, the reason why the jury was biased is because you had eyewitness, overwhelming physical evidence, and the horrific nature of the crime. That's what biased the jury, not because of scowly faces made by one of the defendants in the courtroom. So it was on really an 8-0 vote. People like to say 8-1 because Justice Sotomayor dissented, but the nature of her dissent was not to say that the Kansas Supreme Court followed the law. It was to say, I think the U.S. Supreme Court should stay out of these cases. So it was really 8-0 with one abstention-like vote.
So even what we might call far-left liberals like Ruth Ginsburg
right.
said, Kansas Supreme Court, you're wrong on this issue. That's really important to me, but you still just applied the law incorrectly.
Right. This happened in California in the 1970s and 80s. There was a California Supreme Court justice and several members of her court, Chief Justice, I should say, several members of her court who overturned every death penalty. Of course, it's a much, the state was about 10 times the size, so they had about 10 times the death penalty.
Because they were ideologically opposed to the death penalty, even though the voters of California, through their elected representatives, had said, we do want death penalty.
Yes.
And that's what Kansas voters have said. Not everybody, but
Right. The majority of the legislators since the passage, and then no one has saw fit to overturn the death penalty since the mid-90s. And so you had in the Kansas case, or in the California case, there was one judge who sometimes overturned the death sentences because they found problems with the case, and sometimes did not. And that judge was retained while 3 others were not retained, including this Chief Justice. And the one who was retained said, I don't like the death penalty any more than the Chief Justice did, but I know that I can't substitute my views for the law, and she didn't. She did substitute her views for the law. And if you look at the history of Kansas capital murder cases and the justices that are on the court now, you see up until 2015, when it became very apparent that they were under great electoral threat of non-retention, they overturned every single capital murder sentence.
Wow. So we'll see those judges on the ballot, on the November ballot, and there will be 5 of them listed, and the question is, shall Justice so-and-so be retained, yes or no? And I guess conservatives are saying vote no for everybody except Caleb Stegall,
Well,
basically.
and I say Caleb Stegall, the jury's out, to use a judicial term. I mean, he might turn out, a lot of people appointed by great Republican or conservatives turn out to not have a originalist judicial philosophy, but we just don't have very much sample.
And
so
he did not participate, I think, in the Carr brothers' decision
Nope,
either, because he
that
wasn't on the
happened after.
court or it happened too soon. So
now he might hear the next one, right?
Yeah.
Because the Supreme Court, what their decision in overturning the Kansas court did is it sends it back to that Kansas Supreme Court. So there'll be another Carr brothers hearing, another decision by the court on whether or not to let those sentences stand. And he might well participate in that. He might recuse himself because he might have been involved in some way when he worked for Governor Brown back. But the fact of the matter is he just hasn't made the same mistakes that those other justices have.
Well, hold on to those thoughts for a moment, Joseph. We're going to take a moment off for a commercial break. This is Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, radio show host Joseph Ashby. So as we start to get ready for the new session of the Kansas legislature, that happens the second Monday in January, I believe it is, so it's still a ways away. But one of the big tasks we have to do is to come up with a new school finance formula. We've had one that's been around for quite a while, although revised frequently. But 2 years ago, we threw it out. We went to this block grant formula, which basically froze the formula,
Right.
I think, the way it was. Schools operated last school year under that. They're operating this school year under that. And hopefully, in the legislative session from January through May, the legislature will craft a new school finance formula to fund the following year. What should we look for, Joseph, as important things that Kansans should get in this new formula?
Well, I think visibility, transparency, that's a buzzword we use about government all the time. But right now, the state spends in the neighborhood of $7,000 or $8,000, depending on, I would say between $7,000 and $8,000 if you don't count federal funds. If you throw federal funds in,
That's just the state's contribution.
Yeah.
There's local taxes plus federal
Right.
funds too.
So there is that much money. Total the average is in the $13,000, between $13,000 and $14,000. So, or between 12 and 13. Anyway, so the state spends a lot of money, but what was the number that everybody quoted? It was always the state base aid per pupil.
Yeah, the formula started off with base state aid per pupil, about $3,800 in recent years,
Yeah.
and that number actually went down. But because of and it went down under Governor Sebelius and Parkinson, by the way, but because of the various weightings, the actual money the state spent went up. For example, when the school finance formula started, there was extra money given to school districts for poor students. These are the
Right.
students that are on free or reduced lunches. Well, that weighting started out at 10%. It blossomed to 45% by the time the block grants came in. So even though base state aid may have gone down a little bit, these weightings really exploded, causing overall school spending to rise.
Right. So I used to call it the black box part of the funding formula, where you had this state aid and a multiplier because someone was poor, because they lived in a very rural area.
Non-English speaking.
Yeah, so there was a lot of
There were
things-
about 20 factors.
So there was a lot of things that said, well, let's send a little more money for this particular kind of student who fits these things. And what happened over the years is clever, if you want to use that term. I don't use that in a good way. Clever legislators who wanted to spend more money without looking like they were spending more money would say, well, let's add a different multiplier, or let's increase this multiplier.
The weighting, yeah.
And so that's why you said the weighting went from base aid plus 10% to base aid plus 45%. So what the effect was politically was to tell the public, we're only getting $3,800 a student, when really it was significantly more than that. It's just that the rest of those numbers were hidden from the public. Was it possible to find that out? Sure, if you're reading Wichita Liberty, if you're paying attention to Kansas Policy Institute, but to the average person, it was easier just to hear the number and think, well, that's too low.
If you're listening to your newspaper editorial board, if you're listening to your school superintendent and the school board members and teachers. And that's a tough nut, Joseph, because people respect the school superintendent, especially in small towns. We want to have faith and trust in our superintendent and boards of education and teachers that they're telling us the truth, because after all, they are teaching our kids, most of our kids anyway.
Right. So to me, any new formula that follows the pattern of hiding state spending or making it harder to conceptualize or discuss. I mean, if you ever even go to one of those school board meetings, or a school board, or a get to know the public with a superintendent there, they'll fight you on those facts. And there is enough opacity, right? It's difficult enough to understand that it's really hard, even for somebody who is small government oriented, to come and say, well, I think I know the facts and I think they're this. To hang with the complexity of that formula and all of the things that the superintendent or a school board member or whoever is going to come back to you. So to me, the most important part of it from a structural standpoint is so we can know what's in it. But then from a child standpoint is to put much more focus on the children and much less focus on the system in which the children are educated.
So I think you're saying there, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, Joseph, but a new formula needs to explicitly allow for school choice programs of whatever type, well, several types hopefully we'll have. But so that right now, the opponents of school choice say, well, it drains money away from public schools when we give a kid a voucher to go to a charter school or a private school or whatever it is. So we need to have a formula that that lets people understand, no, that's really not true, that school choice programs actually save the state money.
That's a point, but listen to how, and you phrase it, I think, well, the argument is that it drains money from the public schools. That's where I say the system is not for itself. The system is for the child. And so if it drains money from one place in order to get it attached to a Kansas child who needs to learn stuff, then that's the priority, right? We don't want to arbitrarily harm public schools for no reason, but if the reason is this Kansas child would learn better if they were at a private military-style academy or something like that.
Even
that
charter schools.
Yeah, or a charter school or something like that. Then by all means, let's do what's best for the kid instead of what's best for the system.
And the need is really dramatic. I know viewers on Wichita Liberty TV have seen my charts where on the national tests, ones that the state can't control and fudge the results on like they used to, on the national test, when you look at fourth grade reading, and I think, I'm sure you know this, Joseph, because by that age, if you can't read well, you're probably really in trouble from an educational standpoint. But in fourth grade reading, about 45% of Kansas white students are proficient, but only 15% of black students and 20% of Hispanics. So that is a formula, I think, that just these poor kids, and we've got to do something. Yeah, we could spend more money on the existing system, but it's really hard for me to imagine any amount of money thrown into the existing system that's really going to have much of a dent on those figures.
Now, here's an important point. We talked about multipliers and risk factors that increase funding for the student. Even as that grew, even as the at-risk funding increased while the non-at-risk funding, or the gap increased between at-risk and non-at-risk, where you have a mostly intact family suburban school district like in Andover, something like that, they actually spend way less per student. And Derby's the same way than inside Wichita, and it's because of those risk factors and those multipliers. And yet the achievement gap continues to increase between those suburban and urban school districts. So it is not the achievement gap is not a money problem. We've proven that pretty conclusively with our old funding formula. So it has to be a student-focused system. Dave Trobert had the recent article about Jalen Cruz, I believe his name is, little boy, low reading scores, behavior problems, got a voucher basically to go to a private school here in Wichita. His reading score shot up, his behavioral problems ended, all in the first year. That's the kind of student-centric thing that we ought to have.
Well, hopefully we can get the governor really to support those types of things. We need to take another moment, Joseph, for a commercial message here. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm your host, Bob Weeks, and with me this week, radio star Joseph Ashby of KQAM Radio.
Radio star, huh, Bob?
Yeah, that's right.
How I feel about that. That's,
Joseph, let's talk about United States presidential politics for a moment. During the primary, I know you were a Ted Cruz supporter. Myself, you know, I had a candidate I really liked. He didn't win, but at least he ran, if you know what I mean. Then I went through kind of an evolution. I heard Mike Pompeo talk a lot about Marco Rubio, so I thought, okay, I'll think about him, and that's who I actually voted for in the caucus, Kansas caucus. But after he dropped out, you know, Ted Cruz is a good guy. Now that he's out, you know, I'm back to Gary Johnson because of my libertarian instincts. What about yourself? Who are you favoring these days, Joseph?
I get a lot of
if you want to say.
I get a lot of flack from the listeners. I describe myself as an undecided conservative.
Sure.
And I still feel that way. I go back between the two arguments. One, that there's a binary choice. You don't have to love either candidate. You just have to pick the one that you think will do the least harm or potentially the most good. And I understand that argument. And I understand people concluding that Donald Trump is going to be less harmful, as more likely to put a a Supreme Court justice that would be respectful of the law and of the Constitution rather than just be a rubber stamp for liberal anti-constitutional policy agenda and all the rest. I think past the election, and I think to myself, well, if we could all sort of agree that Donald Trump was a mistake, it just wouldn't be as big a mistake as Hillary Clinton, maybe I'd be okay with this. But there's such a fervor behind him in large sections within the Republican coalition that I'm afraid if he wins and he continues to devalue conservatism, and to me conservatism or conservatarianism is really the only way, a return to constitutionalism is the only way to save the republic from imminent decline.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a deep respect and an understanding that that's the only way to prevent decline, then we're in really big trouble. And if he wins, I think there'll be a certain cheerleading for his brand of politics, which concerns me a lot. So
do we really know what his brand of politics is?
Well, that's part of the problem.
I think we know Hillary Clinton.
If you can latch on to, and there's what a lot of people do. We do know Hillary Clinton, and she is very predictable. She's become very predictable in her politics over the last 5 or so years. You know, you look back 10 years ago, she wouldn't recognize herself because she just does what the party wants her, needs her, what she's chameleonic in the sense that she'll say whatever she thinks she needs to get power. And that worries me a lot. Donald Trump, for his faults, I don't think is as power hungry as Hillary Clinton. I think he enjoys this and he likes the celebrity aspect of it and he's kind of in it for himself, and that bothers me a little bit. But she is dedicated to becoming president for the purpose of becoming president.
Yeah.
That being said,
I think you're right about Trump. You know, there's a lot of times he shows up his lack of knowledge or ignorance about certain things, like the nuclear triad. That was a long time ago. And I kind of get the impression that he doesn't really want to know this stuff. Otherwise, he could be studying up on it, that he's perfectly willing to set some broad policy and then have experts underneath him that actually, you know, do the work of the government. I don't know.
That could be. I think, you know, Obama very much is like that,
Yeah.
where it bothers him to sit and talk about policy all the time. And you know, he used to walk out of his Senate hearings when he was a senator and just kind of shrug his shoulders and drop his shoulders because it was boring to him. And you see that in some of the policy battles, the major ones, particularly in his first term, where he kind of stayed above the fray, didn't really meet with legislators, didn't do much for it. Trump could be that, and that could be a good thing for conservatives if
Depends who he
selects
selects for cabinet and so forth.
and his lodestar to me is himself. It's
Yeah.
loyalty to him that he rewards. And anyway, like I say, the common analogy I hear is if you vote for Hillary Clinton, you're playing Russian roulette with a semi-automatic. And if you vote for Trump, at least it's a revolver that you're playing with. So,
Okay. You know, what really gets me is, I mean, like I say, can't see myself voting for Donald Trump, but I don't hate people who are going to vote for him. I just understand that they've made a different decision. But what I really dislike is people like Sean Hannity of Fox News, who is a major voice in the conservative movement. He really says, if you vote for Hillary Clinton or Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, then I've got it backwards, don't I? If you don't vote for Donald Trump, you are responsible for putting Hillary in office, and I am going to hold you personally responsible for that. That's what really gets me, and it just is this conflict that we've come into. And you know, my mom just says, "How did we ever come to this?" Do you have any ideas of how that happened?
I read a lot of theories on it. I think that it was sort of a perfect storm of the celebrity-centric aspects of our culture, combined with watching John Boehner or Mitch McConnell just kind of fold. I mean, you know, it was like, well, we don't have the presidency, so we can't get anything done. Why isn't Barack Obama saying, well, I don't have the Congress, I can't get anything done? So they seem to surrender their aspect of the constitutional process so easily. And here you had somebody who stood up and didn't seem like he was going to surrender on anything. And that felt really good. And immigration was one of those issues where it seemed like no matter what any Republican said, you couldn't trust them 5 minutes before they would say something else. And he seemed like, of course, he's turned out to be more like a Mitch McConnell or another more establishment Republican on that. And
well, that's really interesting, Joseph, the celebrity aspect you brought up, because Hillary Clinton is our biggest political celebrity by far, I think, and has been for a while. At least I would say that. And Donald Trump is one of our biggest non-political celebrities up to this year. So
she's
the
well
power
known.
of celebrity, I guess.
She's well known, and that certainly propelled her to the Democrat nomination. But she's not a pop culture politician.
Yeah.
Barack Obama was. Barack Obama.
I mean, she didn't win. First of all, Obama beat her 8 years ago.
Right.
So.
Because he was much better at that, at pop culture politics than she was. Which is why, to me, he won 2008. I think almost any Democrat probably could have won that race. In 2012, he beat Romney because he was better at pop culture. And Trump is better, and I think that gives him a puncher's chance, even with a difficult electoral map and his frequent gaffes.
And the polls are close and they're shifting. I think here, almost 2 months away, it's really too early to say much of anything, except that we are out of time. So Joseph Ashby, thank you very much for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and we'll be back again next week.